A very warm welcome to you all and a céad míle fáilte to UCC's Jean Monnet lecture series this afternoon. Well, since we've gone online, which we started doing last month, I'm delighted to welcome our larger audience here again today. We've colleagues joining us not just from Cork and from Ireland, but also from the UK and from the US and from across Europe. So a very warm welcome to everyone. Well, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the support of the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet programme, which is supporting today's event. But let me turn to our speaker now. I'm very sorry that she isn't joining us physically here in Cork today, but I am genuinely delighted to welcome Judy Dempsey to deliver this month's Jean Monnet lecture here at UCC, albeit in virtual format. And to be honest, I can think of really no one better placed to speak on today's theme, which is the EU too soft in defending democracy? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Judy's work, she's a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and she's the editor-in-chief of its Strategic Europe blog since 2012. And the Strategic Europe blog is it's a wonderful resource for academics and practitioners alike. Prior to that, Judy was a columnist for the International New York Times, and she was Germany correspondent in Berlin with the International Herald Tribune. And she's also held a number of roles with the Financial Times, including their diplomatic correspondent, Jerusalem bureau chief, Berlin correspondent, and also Eastern European correspondent. And in fact, in that capacity, she was on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe during those very tumultuous months of 1989 and 1990. And in addition to all of that, Judy has been awarded several journalism prizes, and she's also the author of a number of publications, including a book on Angela Merkel. Well, just turning to today's theme, Judy has been an outspoken critic, I think it's fair to say, of the limits to European Union action in relation to democratic backsliding within the EU, but also on the EU's borders. And I think her work really does provide us with some really important clarity and insight about issues which perhaps don't necessarily receive the airing that they should here in Ireland. Because the damage done to the EU by political developments, which are admittedly taking place very far from these shores, they're consequential for the European Union, and therefore they're consequential for Ireland. And I suppose there's questions to be asked as well about what role a small state like Ireland might play in challenging some of the more sinister and troubling democratic transgressions in other EU member states. And much of this will be drawn out in Judy's lecture today, but there will also be an opportunity for questions and answers. So in that context, we'll be using the chat function for questions. So please feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have either during or after the lecture. I'd also like to say that this event, and ask you to note that this event is being recorded today. My colleague, Jean O'Callaghan, whom I'm very grateful to for all her assistance, is looking after the technical side of things. So if you're having any technical issues, do put a note into the chat and Jean will be able to assist you there. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way and the introductions and welcomes are done, I really am very pleased to pass the floor to Judy Dempsey. Welcome, Judy, and thanks for being with us.
Oh, Mary, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you and your colleagues for this incredibly warm and emotional welcome. It's very historical, all the things you said. It was lovely. Thank you very, very much. Because you encapsulate, I suppose, all my career, which started in the late 1970s, when I had £200 saved. I was in London at the time, and I have to admit to somebody, I have to say this publicly. I had worked for a publishing house, an American publishing house, and then I moved to the New Station briefly, where I was trying to get a leg up the journalism ladder. But in the spare time, I sold advertising for them. And then I said, this is enough. I'm off to Eastern Europe. And this is why this issue is important for me. I went to Eastern Europe for two reasons. And I must thank the Irish Times for financing me, Paul Gillespie in particular, trusting me. I went for two reasons: because I didn't believe the divided Europe was sustainable. I simply didn't believe that this could go on in perpetuity. And the second reason is that I just couldn't imagine not living in freedom. And I experienced this firsthand when I was in the former Czechoslovakia, visiting Havel, in Poland, in Romania, which was truly horrific. And I was in such a privileged position because I had a passport. And you could always leave. And coming out was like leaving, I have to say that it was like leaving a prison on the one hand, but also I left very, very brave dissident friends. So in some ways, this has conditioned me in terms of why the European Union should be just so important in defending values and democracy and human rights. And just to debunk one theory, or one kind of, not propaganda, but one element that is out there, especially in Hungary, that Europe is defending this liberalism and this democracy and these human rights. Human rights are not a European component, they are universal. And what the people in Myanmar are doing today, what they're doing in Belarus, what they're doing in other countries, in Venezuela, across the globe, it is for universal rights. And we must never lose sight of this. And if we remember this, the European Union even has more of an obligation and value to protect a way of life that others aspire to. Having said this, I'm going to get to the nitty-gritty of my talk. I'm not going to bore you with the details of the Lisbon Treaty, which everybody knows inside out, of course. But the Lisbon Treaty actually, done in December 2007, and if I remember right, Chancellor Angela Merkel was president, just ending the presidency of the EU rotating presidency, about to hand it over. Just very briefly, the goals of the European Union: promote peace, its values and the well-being of its citizens, offer freedom, security and justice within internal borders, combat social exclusion, promote scientific, technological progress. Well, we know how well we are with digitization with the corona, respect its rich cultural, linguistic diversity, and establish economic monetary union. But the key thing is promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its citizens. And the treaty is there. All we have to do is actually implement it. And so when I'm in doubt, or if somebody from the Polish government asks me, or the Hungarian government, oh, we don't have any treaties for this, they are written into the treaties, firstly. And secondly, the countries that joined the European Union, whether it was Spain or Portugal or Greece, and later in 2004, this big bang, it was so exciting, the former communist countries, they signed up to this. They voluntarily ceded part of their sovereignty on the one hand, but volunteered to become part of this free, united and whole Europe, a Europe based on values and democracy. Can you imagine former communist countries emerging from years of totalitarianism and being able to embrace the right to travel, freedom, free media, and particularly an independent judiciary? It was such an exciting time. It was almost euphoric, and I remember covering it at the time. So we have these values, but somehow, when it comes to human rights and values, they are, unfortunately, inextricably linked to foreign policy. The European Union should be very proud of being a foreign policy player, but actually it doesn't do foreign policy. And when it does it very badly. This is because foreign policy and human rights is a part of foreign policy, and it should be part of our values architecture. Foreign policy is increasingly difficult to do inside the European Union because it's the member states more and more that set the foreign policy agenda, whether it's regard to Russia, whether it is regard to no foreign policy really with the Middle East, but essentially it's the member states that actually set the tone for this. And this is quite debilitating, because the member states some of them try to balance values with realpolitik, with interests. But as we have seen recently, especially the big EU-China investment deal that was forged at the end of December, just when Angela Merkel ended her 6-month head of the rotating EU Council presidency, it was pushed through. The timing couldn't have been worse, not just because of Hong Kong, the whole suppression of democracy and freedoms there, the suppression of the Uyghur community in China, how any journalists who actually question the Chinese government's attitude towards dealing with the pandemic, Chinese journalists are either silenced, and so is the internet. I mean, was this the time to do an investment accord? More importantly, if you're going to do one, at least couple it with a package of values, of transparency, of accountability. Trade doesn't come cheap, and trade can be very insidious. But the ability to use trade accords to influence or to create some kind of structure of values is a role that the European Union and some member states are really pushing for. And this is a very important component of the Trade Commissioner, and I think it should be used much, much more. We have seen the trade agreements with Canada, hoping to do a trade agreement with Australia. We have one with South Korea. But since these countries want trade agreements with the EU, and of course the EU want trade agreements with them, let's actually anchor some of these trade agreements on the idea of values, of basic democratic principles of accountability, and of the independent judiciary, and of the rule of law, and a kind of checks and balances. This may sound a very big shopping list, but this is essential to democracies. This is essential for market economies. This is essential actually for what we believe in, which is the West and the European Union. This is the first point. The second issue related to this foreign policy and democracy, why are we so bad at doing foreign policy? As I said before, it's the member states, but it's also, we're not integrated. Since we have member states setting their own agendas, whether it's Germany on China, France on perhaps on the Sahel and other issues, the northern countries look at their own interests in the Arctic and relations with Russia. But essentially, because we're not integrated and because we rely on unanimity, any discussion when it comes to human rights or sanctions go for the lowest common denominator. It is plain to see that this is a debilitating factor for Europe to be a global player. And if we had a qualified majority voting on some issues, I think it would make Europe stronger. Of course, there would be some member states that saying, oh, the bigger ones will call the shots the whole time. Well, in fact, the bigger ones do call the shots, but rather negatively at the moment, particularly when it comes to Russia. And we saw this mealy-mouthed response to Navalny's prison sentence. 4 people sanctioned. President Putin can only laugh at this. It has no meaning whatsoever. What has meaning is actually using our values and using our economic clout to actually take on, to head on the whole Nord Stream pipeline. This would be an issue that would seriously have repercussions for Russia in the sense that it would mean that Europeans are taking their values seriously. And indeed, Nord Stream funds Gazprom, and Gazprom, as you know, is the tool, the state tool of the Kremlin. So this is a real problem that Europe isn't integrated on this issue, and it's the voting problem that unanimity, it just goes for the lowest common denominator. But actually, you can always find excuses why the EU doesn't act on human rights. But essentially, the EU.
Sorry, Judy, will you just unmute yourself there, please?
I'm sorry about that.
Perfect. No, my fault. It's perfect, Judy. That was my fault.
I don't have to repeat all the thing again.
No.
Anyways, and the thing is, you can always use the voting system as an excuse for inaction. But in fact, if the EU does believe in its values, it's got 2 things to do. It cannot preach to other countries outside the EU if it's not going to get its own house in order. And I'm referring to Poland, I'm referring to Hungary, I'm referring to Bulgaria, and I will touch on Slovenia in a minute or 2. And for several years, in fact, there was an attempt in 2005 when Law and Justice, the Polish nationalist conservative government, first won election, there was an attempt there to rein in the judiciary. and they lost office in 2007. They came back again in 2015. And since then, there has been a sustained, systematic attack on the judiciary in Poland. It is an attack which is creating huge mistrust by the public of the judiciary because of the propaganda campaign. It is creating a climate of fear in some ways, but more importantly, it's creating this sense that all the gains that were made in 1989 during the peaceful roundtable negotiations between Solidarity and the communists, which were about to leave power, it seems as if this kind of transformation is being reversed. It's an astonishing development. It's been happening since 2015. The European Union, the Commission, the Council, and what is now the European External Service were warned about it, and they didn't take action. And we've seen how more and more now the elements, the levels of the judiciary are being chiseled away under authority. The positive news about Poland is that the civil society is very, very strong. And when there was an attempt a week ago by Law and Justice, the governing Law and Justice Party, to impose a very severe tax on newspapers, meaning the private newspapers and the media, there was a huge uproar about this. They've backed away, but they will surely be back. The point is that if the EU allows the rule of law to be attacked, this gives the powers in government the chance to bypass the judiciary and move on to attacking other independent institutions, such as the media, and the next on the item will be the academic institutions, the universities, high schools, institutes, research centres. And this is what's happening in Hungary. And the Hungary story is all too familiar to all of you. On front of our eyes, we have seen Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary and leader of Fidesz, the Conservative Party, actually, with his 2/3 majority in the parliament, chisel away at the basic structures of democracy. And the Commission in Brussels have discussed this, and shall we sanction them? No, we can't. Well, let's see what happens. And they send these negotiators up to Warsaw and Budapest. But of course, so little has happened until quite recently. So essentially, the Commission
Judy, sorry, apologies. You'll just have to do it one more time.
The Commission has been, you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Judy, we can.
Okay, there
Sorry,
we go.
Judy.
No, it's all right. It's not a problem.
Sorry.
Now, we can always pass the blame to the Commission, pass the blame to anybody. But in fact, some of the real culprits in not taking on Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria and Slovenia is the European People's Party. This is the conservative grouping for Christian democratic parties throughout the EU member states. And for several years, Fidesz is a member of it. For several years, they've been saying, oh, well, we'll try to we defend our values and democracies. But if you're going to defend your values and democratic institutions and the rule of law, surely the first thing is to suspend the members and have some kind of disciplinary procedures to do this. And of course, this hasn't been done. Fidesz has been, I think, temporarily suspended now, but the damage is so great now that it's been very difficult to undo this damage unless the Hungarian opposition really unite, get a coherent program together and be strong enough to defeat Fidesz in the elections, which I think will take place in 2022. But the point is there's so much damage to undo, and it's going to demand an awful lot of political will from the citizens of Hungary to get Hungary back on a democratic path again. The point is, this is part of the EU's own doing. And if it firmly believes in values and democracy, you we must put our own house in order. And if we don't, and we see this already happening in Slovenia, where Prime Minister Janša is now trying to rein in the media and perhaps replicate what Hungary has done. And only 3 weeks ago, Hungary closed a wonderful internet Klub Radio, a wonderful outlet for news, and really super professional, because it was independent. It didn't pull the Orban Fidesz line. And now Slovenia is trying to do the same thing. In short, if the EU continues to turn a blind eye or to just mete out wishy-washy disciplinary threats to these countries, more and more member states will actually try, at least some of their leaders will actually try to accumulate power at the expense of strengthening and consolidating the democratic institutions. One element which is important to all of this, democracies are very messy. And the transition that took place across Eastern Europe and the Baltic states after 1989, yes, of course they were messy. Why shouldn't they be messy and difficult after so many years of totalitarianism? All the more reason, though, to actually encourage them to build these democratic structures. But to build democratic structures and make them sustainable, you need a strong middle class. And the middle classes were destroyed either during the Second World War, especially the Jewish communities, but afterwards, the middle classes that remained in Eastern and Central Europe and the Baltic states, they were deprived of their livelihoods because of the communist system. And there was massive industrialization and a whole rural dislocation from rural communities going to the cities. But essentially, without a kind of liberal middle class identity and entity, democracy becomes difficult to build. This is not an excuse to explain what is happening in Hungary and Poland at the moment, but it's an attempt to explain the fragility of political cultures and the fragility of democracies, that they need time and constant nurturing. And so when an Orban or a Kaczynski threatens or recognizes the weakness of these young democracies, they actually sometimes find it very difficult to actually hold back the strengthening and the internalization of democratic practices. There's another aspect to all of this, and this relates to what's happening inside the EU with regard to democracy and values, and what's happening outside the EU to values and democracy. I would be very interested to hear what the participants say, but there's a penchant by many EU member states and generally by the EU culture to go along with the status quo. And we saw this disastrous philosophy, I suppose, or policy before the Arab Spring. The EU supported the status quo, authoritarian regimes. Development aid was generally given to the state to distribute. Civil society was in the hands of the state, and any genuine independent civil society activists were certainly under huge pressure, but the EU, with exceptions, rarely involved them, rarely met them or kept them at a distance. Essentially, the EU was very much a status quo. And we saw what happened in the Arab Spring. We were totally unprepared for it, and we are still haven't gotten over this element of how to deal with the civil society, the emerging civil society in the Middle East. We can just look at what's happening in Lebanon, for instance, the huge frustration of the young people that they cannot actually topple a corrupt political class, which the European Union has dealt with, and they knew what was going on in Lebanon for such a long time. And related to this idea of the EU more comfortable with the status quo because they know the players there and it's sort of predictable, except the status quo, if it's authoritarian, actually sows the seeds of its own destruction or instability. And this is my second point, stability versus instability. What does the European Union like most? And what do business community like most? Predictability and stability. And we have a very interesting example, actually, is the EU, and particularly France and Germany's attitude towards President Sisi in Egypt. The reign of Sisi is actually, according to human rights activists, far worse now than under President Mubarak. The number of people who've disappeared, the detention, the trials of military courts, the torture, the disappearances, the utter destruction, attempts to destroy the civil society, locking up the Muslim Brotherhood, reducing any kind of political inclusiveness or political participation. Some European leaders have told me, oh, well, we need Sisi for stability, to clamp down on terrorism. And remember, Sisi was given the red carpet treatment in the Elysee several months ago by President Macron. Macron needs Sisi because he justified this, because he's a great protector against terrorism. But if you go on this philosophy of engaging leaders only on the basis that they actually deal with terrorism, you're laying the seeds of your own weaknesses, because this will lead to more instability, not stability, and instability will lead to refugee crisis, a migration crisis, a civil strife, and violence. Is this really in Europe's interests? Essentially, Europe, if European leaders are going to talk to Sisi and to other authoritarian leaders, at least go with a suitcase that is packed with ideas, with a need for a dialogue, with the confidence that you're not interfering in the internal affairs of another country. You're actually trying to establish some kind of dialogue. I think this dialogue is, some may tell me, oh, this is just naive, but let me give you an example. On environmental issues, this is where the EU could play an enormous role in human rights and values. If for water disputes, for irrigation, for dams, this would be the ideal opportunity for the European Union to put its values into real practice. In other words, if a country comes to the EU, the European Investment Bank, and says, oh, we'd like some funding for this new dam or this new irrigation system or new arable land project, involve civil society, involve non-governmental organizations, involve voices. Voices are so important to puncture the complacency of authoritarian regimes. And also it may be a signal or a way of informing authoritarian leaders that there are voices out there, and if you don't listen to them, they may come back to haunt you. So essentially, we could do much more in reconciling this value and realpolitik and interest. They are reconcilable, but we have to be extremely confident that that in our dossier is not only the interests of contracts and not only the interests of big trade investment accords, it's in the interests of values, marrying the two together. And if you don't marry the two together, there'll be not only will there be a dangerous imbalance, but in fact, those that actually support reform and want the universal values, they will actually in some ways feel betrayed by the European Union. And the European Union, I feel, since it wants to be a global player, does have a certain responsibility for all of this. So having dealt with the status quo and the stability and other issues, I will now touch on what can the EU do in practical terms. I think in some ways the EU will have to decide what it wants to be. And Emmanuel Macron, the French president, spelt out very early on in his presidency how he saw Europe. It wasn't a Gaullist to Europe, as some would suggest. It was an attempt to shake Europe out of this comfort zone of complacency that we can just muddle through. And Macron wanted a European Union that was more integrated in terms of security, in terms of defense, in terms of taking not just responsibility, but giving itself an ambitious direction. And unfortunately, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, didn't reply to him. In fact, very few countries replied to France. And now we are in this situation that the member states are blaming each other for dealing with the whole corona mess. They're blaming the Commission. The Commission is blaming different sections of the Commission. And essentially, this shows all the more reason, in my view, for a European Union that should be based on principles, on values, and in fact, this actually requires a kind of integration. I'm not so sure the European Union can successfully push for values and principles and really a strong believer in accountability if it doesn't become more integrated. This is not about having a huge anonymous bloc. It's about Europe actually taking its values seriously. And I think we should take stock of this. Just look what's happening around the world, whether it's in Venezuela or Myanmar or closer to home in Poland and Hungary. Democracies are fragile, as I said earlier. Human rights is fragile, but these are universal values which the people of Myanmar are now fighting for their lives to protect. They got a taste of it in 2012, and they want to hold on to this and nurture it. And the EU, actually, by way of example, could do much more to help them. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Judy, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really struck by listening to the way in which you've taken stock of all that's happening within Europe and outside of Europe, how fragile democracy is, as you've pointed out. And we've really seen that in recent years. We've even seen it in the United States, to be frank. It's, I think, really important that we reflect on that, you know, and that we think about what that means. Not just for those states themselves, but for the EU and for Ireland as a small member state within the EU. So thank you sincerely for your comments and for sharing all of that with us and giving us so much to think about and to reflect on. And our audience has been reflecting on it while you've been talking. So there are some questions coming in, which I'll put to you if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
The first question, actually, I might go to Dr. Brian Turner from University College Cork. Brian, you might like to ask the question yourself. It's a really interesting question about the United Nations and some comparison with the EU. Brian, I'm not sure if you're still there or if you'd like to.
I was having a little bit of trouble unmuting myself. Apologies for that. No, I was interested. Thanks a million, Judy. That was really interesting. I was very interested when you were talking about the idea that essentially EU foreign policy is being dictated by member states, and the competing interests between member states are almost hamstringing the foreign policy at an EU level. And it struck me that it's a little bit similar. I think anyway. I get the sense it's a little bit similar to the UN, which seems to be paralysed by the veto that permanent members of the Security Council have. So, is it an issue? Is there an inherent difficulty in I suppose bringing organizations or multilateral institutions together when there are so many competing national interests, or is it an issue of the need for unanimity?
Yeah. Oh, I was expecting a very tough question. Okay. The veto is it's so debilitating. And we have seen over Syria, for instance, Russia and China imposing the veto, despite the huge violence that has been meted out to innocent people in Syria. I think we're getting at something very fundamental here. The multilateral institutions are in desperate need of reform. The post-1945 era, which was based on multilateralism and the big, deep transatlantic relationship, it's had its time. But because of the complexities of globalization, but also countries becoming more ambitious, maybe this has been tried before, but these multilateral institutions do need serious reform on the voting, on the structure, and the representation. I often wonder. And I know the Ireland is now very much on the Security Council now, and they're doing a terrific job, I heard, especially the Human Rights Commissioner But I mean, small countries somehow are more effective. But when it comes to the major issues, the nuclear powers, the big five, call the shots. And I think it's time to reform them. And as you say, the big two in Europe call the shots most of the time as well, which is a great pity. The Dutch are punching below their weight. Ireland, in alliance with small countries, has enormous influence and respect, but it's not enough when it comes to the big decisions. It's Berlin mostly and Paris. I didn't bring this up in the discussion, but if somebody wants to ask me later about the role of Germany, I'd be happy to spend 2 minutes on it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Judy. I'm going to go to a question in the chat from Tiona, which is probably another very challenging question. The concrete measures that the EU should take when you take into account some of the sort of limited legal mechanisms that are available, and the necessity for unanimity among the member states. Like, what can realistically be done within that sort of constraining framework?
Thank you, Tiona. I think you're from Georgia. Best of luck with your country is going through turmoil as we speak, actually. Somehow I think that the possibility of suspending voting rights, I mean, this would hurt. I mean, when Poland and Hungary tried to blackmail the EU saying they would block the recovery fund for the recovery after the pandemic, and frankly, this is against our own interests and against the whole idea of solidarity. But suspending voting rights is one thing. Secondly, Poland and Hungary each get about 3 to 4% of their total GDP comes from the EU taxpayer. And the EU taxpayer is actually indirectly financing cronyism. And I think if we, I think, frankly, a combination of sanctions or holding back structural funds could make a difference. Some would say, oh, well, this would affect the Polish citizen and the Hungarian citizen. Anybody see the Eurobarometers, how pro-European they are lately? And they want the EU to play a much tougher role on reining in the Polish and Hungarian governments. But as I said, we have these instruments. Practically, we can use them. But politically, it demands political will and leadership, especially from Germany.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if I might sort of abuse my position as chair and just ask you a related question. I was very interested in what you said about the European People's Party, particularly given that Fine Gael, which is a party in government here in Ireland, is a member of the European People's Party, and how sort of reticent they have been about suspending Orban and his party. Like, what is holding back the EPP members? What are the sticking points there that are preventing that from happening?
Well, since the EPP is the biggest grouping, it's a voting. It gets back to votes again, pushing through some legislation, pushing through this, that, favors, lobbies, and so on. It's almost primitive, but in fact, the EPP is playing Orban's game. It's a kind of sophisticated cronyism. And to be fair, the socialist grouping has done the same when it comes to other countries running roughshod over the rule of law. In some ways, these groupings in the European Parliament really have to take stock of what they really stand for. And Martin Weber keeps going on saying about the rule of law. Well, I mean, he's been defending Orban indirectly for such a long time. And by the way, so have politicians inside Germany. Mm-hmm. I mean, as you know, the German EPP representation is very big, but it degrades the European Parliament. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, the Green presence is quite high now, and they're being very outspoken about the EPP's attitude towards Warsaw and Bulgaria and Hungary, but words are not enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Judy. I have another question in the chat, and it's about Article 7 and your opinion on it and its enforcement. And that's a question from Massimo D'Angelo. And he's basically asking, do you think Article 7 is working?
No. We will see. We will see in the coming weeks with the distribution of the funds, actually. But Article 7 needs immense scrutiny, and it needs immense follow-up. And I'm not so sure the Commission is prepared to do this. maybe we have this new human rights mechanism which was passed last December, but I fear the Article 7 issue may become just bogged down in bureaucracy and political infighting and trade-offs. And I think this is what Warsaw and Budapest and Sofia are banking on. But it should be used, and it can be used. But as I said before, it's going to demand the Commission working very closely with the Council and the European Parliament to push this through.
Thanks, Judy. The next question is from Jacqueline Fitzgibbon. It's another really interesting question. Jacqueline, I'm not sure if you'd like to ask the question yourself, if you'd like to unmute. It's a very interesting question about, I suppose, society within Hungary and the support that that Viktor Orban has.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Great. Hi, Judy. Great, great to hear from you. I'm a big fan of your Strategic Europe newsletter. I get it every day. So my question there, I suppose, was about Hungary, and considering that Orban has, I suppose, you know, quite a sizable parliamentary majority, so presumably he's popular in Hungary. I'm not any expert in Hungary now, I don't know an awful lot about it. But what can the EU do to impose then kind of values on Hungary that aren't shared by their electorate? Presumably aren't shared by their electorate anyway.
Well, there's the electorate on the one hand. Fidesz went down a couple of months ago in the opinion polls, but it's up again. The electorate is very important. Secondly, the electorate would probably change a little if the opposition really is serious about uniting all the various opposition parties and coming up with a program explaining to the electorate what is happening to the money, explaining to them what has happened to EU funds, explaining to them the level of corruption, explaining to them who financed the big football stadium where Orban lives outside Budapest, explaining to them where the money goes. This is the first thing. Secondly, the EU must communicate. They must get out of their bubbles in the capital cities, whether it's among the member states or the non-member states. They must go to the towns and cities and hold town hall meetings explaining what the EU is about, that it actually matters that people have recourse to the independent judges, that they have recourse to free media, that they have recourse to human rights, basic human rights. And I think this is one of the real Achilles heels of the EU. It's unbelievably bad at communicating and explaining what it really stands for. And none of this is actually rocket science, Jacqueline. If the EU believes in itself and believes that it has an immense role to play, which was bequeathed to it after 1945, all the more reason to actually try to promote and explain these values, and they're not doing it. They're doing a very poor job at explaining it.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks, Jacqueline, for the question. There's a question from Bozena in the chat, which is asking about the European Union framework being ill-equipped to deal with the 2004 enlargement, and that is perhaps a root of some of the problems we're encountering now.
You can always blame enlargement for everything, frankly. Bożena, I don't know if you're Polish. Look, I was based in Brussels for the FT covering enlargement. It was after 1989. It was the second happiest moment of my professional life. It was so exciting. It was a physical return to Europe. And blaming this big enlargement, no. We should blame, the EU should blame itself for not seeing the transition through. And this transition, as I said earlier, is about painstakingly building the blocks of democracy. It takes a very, very long time. And I must say, I've got to sympathize with any, not you now, with any of the countries who joined the EU in 2004. I remember talking to the Hungarians and Poles at the time. The acquis communautaire, the poor things, I mean, there was the size of football pitches that they had to read. And there was a rush to implement, but implement is very different from being able to absorb legislation. and from being able to absorb finance. So no, I wouldn't blame enlargement. I think this is very, very special. And remember, if they weren't in the EU, they would have been in a far worse position now. And heaven knows what Russia would be doing with these countries at the moment. One last point, we have a problem with future enlargements because there's a kind of negative reaction towards enlargement, but we have to deal with the Western Balkans. This is our back garden. These are our neighbors. These are our future stability. And we've turned a blind eye to the Russian and Chinese influence there. Bringing them in is a long-term cost, but keeping them out will be a very short-term and dangerous loss to the EU.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks, Bozena, who has confirmed Polish nationality. So great to have you with us. Tio Moga, Tio, you might like to ask the question yourself. Again, another interesting question about Emmanuel Macron and his position on the EU's strategic autonomy on defence and security. Are you there, Tio?
Oh yeah. Tio Multomets, hello. Can you hear me? I'll answer it.
No, you can see the question, Judy?
Yes.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, Tio.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Many thanks for this excellent talk, Judy. My question is the following. Yeah. Why does Emmanuel Macron, for instance, push for the EU's strategic autonomy in terms of defense and security, when he knows for a fact that the Central Eastern European countries, for instance, would not easily accept any move in the foreign policy security direction, which would lead to a lesser role of the United States in this thing. And linked to this, should we understand the rush to complete the investment agreement with China in the same key? Okay. I mean, EU's autonomy? Thank you so much.
Oh, molto bene. So, I'm going to be really brief on this because it's such a complex question. The strategic autonomy debate is overblown and no kind of substance has been built into it, firstly. Secondly, an element of strategic autonomy is very important for the European Union because it has become so intellectually and militarily dependent on the United States to such an extent that it doesn't think strategically, it doesn't think security-wise, or it doesn't think collectively in defense-wise. I think this is a very negative aspect for Europe. If you want to be a global player, you have to have a very strong security and defense component. I think it's crucial. And this brings in a different issue of hard power. The other point is strategic autonomy does not mean cutting away from the United States. The United States actually want Europe to take much more care of its own security and defense. But since EU members, so many EU member states are members of NATO and vice versa, there's no question that the EU would draw away from NATO. There was a little bit of a question about that under the Trump administration. But essentially, Macron is saying to the Europeans, without going into too much detail, we have all these defense structures. We have 14 different kinds of helicopters, different kinds of tanks, different methods of interoperability. It's enough. We're wasting money on this. And it's time that we had some kind of integrated defense posture. I think the debate is only beginning, but I think it's a necessary debate. One thing, Thierry, you're absolutely right. The Central Europeans and the East Europeans, especially Romania, are highly suspicious of France's motives. They believe it's a kind of Gaullist defense plan. Well, all the more reason for Macron to actually engage the East Europeans and the Balkans and the Baltic states much more. He's slowly beginning to do it. But at the moment, there's suspicion of this, and your country and the Central Europeans are much more Atlanticist, perhaps, much more Atlanticist and less European defense than some countries in the EU would be, if you understand my meaning. Now, what do you think the EU-based NGOs can do? Oh, no, sorry, that's Belarus. Oh,
China.
that was extraordinary timing. Biden had just been elected, and Brussels and Washington said, "Oh yes, we need a common Chinese strategy." You're absolutely right. We go from a position of strength if we deal with China together. This is very important. And overnight, the conversation might as well not have taken place. This is a dangerous kind of autonomy, and it plays into the Chinese hands of divide and rule.
Thanks, Judy. And thanks, Theo, for the question. Actually, it touches on an issue which is important to Ireland as well, security and defence, which is challenging for very different reasons. But nevertheless, like you say, this is an emerging debate within the EU, and I think one that all member states are going to have to grapple with in the not too distant future. The next question is from Jessica. Jessica, would you like to answer, or sorry, would you like to ask your question? It's a question about Russia and Belarus.
Okay.
Jessica, there you go. Do you want to ask?
Question?
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm muted now. Hi, Judy, thank you so much for your analysis so far. Yes, so I suppose my name is Jessica Nivani and I work for Index on Censorship. It's a freedom of expression organisation. We're based in London. And one of our former colleagues actually is imprisoned at the moment in Belarus. And so while we work, globally, a lot of our work at the moment is going into Belarus naturally. And it's a very difficult, as you know, it's a very difficult environment at the moment, and we're really struggling to be creative in terms of how we can, I suppose, advocate and have an impact really there in a situation where we're kind of bound to feel powerless. So I'd be really interested in hearing your views on that in terms of, you touched on the Russian individual sanctions, and I'd be interested to hear about how the situation differs in Belarus. What do you think the EU should be doing to support civil society and media freedom there, and how we as European civil society can encourage the EU to do more as well?
Yeah,
thanks a lot.
Jessica, it's painful looking at what happens in Belarus every single day. And I think the EU rhetoric has been very disappointing. Some of the member states, particularly the Baltic states and Poland and Sweden and Germany behind the scenes are very active, but practically this is what we can do. We've got to support the social media as much as possible. And this means they're going to need financial help, they're going to need protection, they're going to need some kind of refuge. Secondly, students who are being harassed or who are afraid of just their livelihoods, they should immediately be given Erasmus scholarships, and we should open up centres in Lithuania and the Baltic states to keep the education system going, and if things ever improve, then they can go back. Thirdly, we have to support young entrepreneurs and small factory owners as much as possible financially. They're being targeted by Lukashenko and his security forces if they even fly the red and white Belarusian flag. Fourthly, we have to give as much legal assistance as possible. But fifthly, we have to be consistent in speaking out against what Lukashenko is doing. The sanctions are meaningless if they're not much more heavily targeted. And I think the EU has been very, very slow on this. Another thing which I find, I don't know what you think of this, Jessica, I'm staggered by the lack of coverage in the Western press on Belarus. And I often wonder why. I mean, we try to write as much as possible in Strategic Europe about it, but somehow, there's a tiredness, or it's as if we're stuck in our comfort zone and we don't see our European Union neighbour, citizens day in, day out since August, risking their lives and been thrown into prison without any due process. So the more op-eds, the more open condemnation by EU leaders from top to bottom. This should be absolutely persistent. My real worry about Belarus is that many EU member states see Belarus through the prism of Russia. And there's fear, if we interfere in Belarus, it'll provoke Russia. I thought last time I looked, Belarus was an independent state.
Thanks, Judy. We just have two questions which I'm going to ask together, just because I'm conscious of time. The first one is about, I thought we'd get through today without talking about Brexit, but it has come up, and whether you think other member states will follow and leave the EU after the UK's decision. And that's a question from Aisha. And then a final question from James, who talks about the importance of human rights globally, which you spoke about, rather than locally within Europe. And you talked about genocide, the plight of Hong Kong and Myanmar, and what role you see the EU assuming in tackling these crises, and more importantly, by what mechanisms. I suppose this speaks to the notion of the EU becoming a global power.
Let me deal with the second question first. Don't worry, there'll be time for that awful B word. I think about this a lot, how the EU can make a difference. And it's just not going out of the capital cities and talking to people. It's I think about the day after, and the day after means preparing for the day after. So in the case of Belarus or what's happening in other countries, the EU should actually target development aid in a much more concerted fashion for civil society, for schools. We don't want, sorry if anybody's going to give me a scholarship, we don't want a Jean Monnet University in Florence. We want them in Eastern Europe. We want them in Ukraine. We want them in Azerbaijan, in Armenia, in Georgia. Get the EU institutions out there. And there's a diaspora working inside the EU who are educated, motivated, ready to go home and teach. Use our institutional educational capacities and the development aid. I think this is, we cannot get enough of this. And I mean, this gets out of the politics area and goes into the whole social infrastructure of reaching out, of communicating, of teaching, of preparing the next generation for the next day. We cannot wait for the day after. We've got to prepare for the day after. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, this is what the Belarusian government in exile, part of it, is doing, preparing for the day after. But psychologically and philosophically, I'm not so sure the EU is even thinking of this. Brexit. With other countries, other countries don't have an economic interest in leaving, and they don't have this old imperial hangover either. And also they've seen how messy the negotiations have been and how difficult and how firm the Commission was. I think Brexit is a great shame, actually, for Northern Ireland, for the peace process, for Ireland, and for the skill that British diplomats did bring to the EU. And all this talk, well, they held up European security and defence. We'll always find an excuse to blame another member state for not doing things. We could have pressed ahead in some ways on coalitions of the willing. But I cannot see other countries leaving, but I do worry of the trend that's taking place, that some member states may actually opt for a two-speed Europe, the way things are going, and this would have a very not damaging. It would undermine the confidence of some of the countries who are not in the Eurozone, for instance. And this is where Angela Merkel is so acutely sensitive about not going down for the two-speed Europe. But at the moment, I mean, frankly, if Hungary wants to leave, well, give it to their people to have a referendum. Mm-hmm. Then we'll see how well Orban will do.
Mm-hmm. Well, Judy, thank you so much. The clock has beaten us, I'm afraid. So we're up against it in terms of time, but I just want to finish by thanking you sincerely for a really fascinating discussion, which is, you know, a frank discussion as well, I think, and a really interesting questions and answer sessions as well. But most especially, I do want to thank you for your generosity in joining us here in UCC, and, you know, your honesty and your heartfelt engagement with all of these issues. It's really refreshing to see that. And I think much of what you said today is something that we, as Irish citizens, as students, as public representatives, can take on board in terms of confronting some of these challenges, which, as I said at the start, are as consequential for us as they are for anyone else, even though distance might suggest otherwise. So sincere thanks for being with us today. It really was. It was really a joy to have you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Jean O'Callaghan for her technical support today as well. And I must mention the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet programme again, which is making these kinds of events possible. But a big thank you in particular to our audience who've joined us, as you can see, from all around Europe in particular, and who made such an important contribution in terms of great questions. The next Jean Monnet lecture is in March, and we will be talking about the B word then, I'm afraid. But it will be delivered by Naomi Long, who's leader of the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland, and we're very much looking forward to that. So for all our audience members, do keep an eye on my Twitter account and on the UCC Department of Government and Politics website for updates on that if you are interested. But until then, a final thanks again to Judy and to all of our audience today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was a great honor. Thank you.
Thanks.
Keep well and safe. Bye-bye. Bye.